May it please the court, members of the jury. We've reached the end. You have heard all the testimony, you have seen all the evidence. The judge has instructed you on the law. In a moment, you're going to go back to that jury room and apply the law to the facts of this case. And as you deliberate, there should be one thing that is absolutely clear. Charlene is innocent of these charges. She simply has no blood on her hands. During the jury selection process, we talked a lot about your want and your need to have all the information in front of you before you make a big decision. And you all said that in any aspect of your life, before you make a big decision, none of you are scared to ask questions to get the information you need if you feel like you don't have it. At the end of my opening statement, I asked you to continue to do just that, to continue to ask questions. Hold the state accountable. Demand the answers. Make them prove beyond a reasonable doubt that no one but Charlene could have done this crime. Ask questions. Questions like, what about Mr. Potter? Yes, he testified that he saw Charlene and the victim driving towards a bonfire that night. But nobody testified about any interaction the two girls had once they got there. What about the fact both Charlene and Sarah told the police they got home about 11 p.m. that night? The medical examiner's report put the time of death at around 11:30. What about the fact that a vehicle matching Paula's was seen at a gas station near the bonfire between 11:45 and 12:15? Now, Paula says her car was at her grandmother's, which would be fairly easy to prove if the state wanted to answer that question. But they didn't. And Tara Arnold, we heard she didn't get home till about midnight that night. What was she doing so late? All reasonable questions that we don't have the answer to. But the state seems to want to rely on that mountain of physical, forensic, scientific evidence. Let's look at that. This is all the physical, forensic evidence the state has that implicates Charlene, that points the finger at Charlene. Nothing. Not one police report, not one lab report, not one hair, one fiber, one fingerprint, one trace of DNA. Nothing. Which isn't to say that there isn't forensic evidence in this case. There's quite a lot of it, actually. None of it just implicates Charlene. There's the bloody towel, soaked in the victim's blood, in fact, found with hairs of the victim and hairs of an unknown individual. Remember, unknown individual means we know who it's not. We know it's not Charlene. And the state wants to talk about the shock and the outrage over this case, and rightfully so. It just doesn't seem that the shock and the outrage quite translates to attention to detail on the part of the police. Because now, that towel, those hairs, evidence that shows Charlene did not do this, have gone missing from the police evidence locker. They're trying to take things out of an empty box. And while we're on the topic of unknown individuals, there is the bloody palm print on the victim's pickup. We know who it doesn't belong to. It does not belong to Charlene. Perhaps the state would just try to identify who that palm print belongs to. Maybe even go so far as to have a conversation with them before they charge a young girl with murder. But the state chose not to do that. But that bloody palm print does not belong to Charlene. Her hands have no blood on them. And thank goodness for John. Thank goodness for John for being able to put to the right context the relationship between Charlene and the victim. Because if it wasn't for that, we would only be left to think that Charlene was maturing as a young woman, putting the rivalries and the pettiness and the competing popularity of high school girls in the past with high school as they graduated and moved forward. Charlene was simply doing what we hope all of our children do as they mature and have more adult relationships. And thank goodness for John for letting us in on that conversation that was so sinister that only he heard, where Charlene was going to get a ride from the victim. There was nothing sinister about that. There was nothing even secret about that. In the big email Charlene sent out to everybody inviting them to the bonfire, Charlene put in there that she was going to get a ride from the victim. Nothing secret. But we can take John's word for it. John, who has no bias in this case, no reason to point the finger unnecessarily. Well, except that maybe if John wasn't busy pointing that finger at Charlene, there's a big chance that fingers would be pointed right at him. The victim had just broken up with John, just dumped him, going off to the big city on a full scholarship to follow her dreams. Dreams that did not include John. He's left here watching the best thing in his life leave him. And for all John's talk about ignoring Charlene and not paying her any attention, he was included in that big email that went to everybody. And more than that, John accepted the invitation. He went to the bonfire that night. Why? To see the victim? Did she spurn his advances? Was she adamant that they were through? John said that he was still pretty hung up on the victim. That night, did something just finally snap with John? And what about John's timeline? He left that little caveat in there. He left around 11. He's not exactly sure. He was goofing off with his friends, so he's not sure what time he left. Well, we would probably have a better idea what time he left if we heard from any of those friends that he was goofing off with. But we didn't. We don't know what time John left. We sure don't know what time John got home. Wouldn't you like to know what John was doing in between that time? These are all reasonable questions that we don't have the answer to. But yet, for all of those questions, it is Charlene who sits on trial for murder. And the state is asking you to believe, beyond a reasonable doubt, that they have proven these four things. Members of the jury, the question for you, quite simply, is number 3. Do you believe, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Charlene caused the death of the victim? Beyond a reasonable doubt. There is overwhelming doubt in this case. There are unanswered question after unanswered question with unidentified people lining up out the door. If only we know who those people are. The state has not shown that it was Charlene who did this. The state needs to identify who left that bloody palm print. It wasn't Charlene. Her hands have no blood on them. Find Charlene not guilty.